Now soon, you will deal with the many protruding tentacles of the violating tentacle monster.
Today in Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look back at Stonekeep, a one-off dungeon crawl experience meant to become a bigger franchise, but seeing as it was released around the start of Interplay's troubles, it'd be nearly 2 decades before another game was made in the series, as an exclusive Nintendo WiiWare title of all things. Now really, that's kinda too bad, because this was definitely a game which drew the short end of the stick and deserved more chances to get more recognition than it ultimately got. I mean, sure, at first glance, Stonekeep doesn't look like anything special, nor does it really stand out amongst similar titles like Dungeon Hack, Ultima Underworld, Eye of the Beholder, just to name a few. But Stonekeep does something somewhat unique amongst those kinds of dungeon crawls, in that it's a heavily simplified experience, without sacrificing the quantity of content, while also using a leveling system similar to what you would find in Daggerfall and later Elder Scrolls games, whereby you level up each individual skill by using those skills. Now that said, it's got some quirks. Okay, it's got a lot of quirks, but nothing which really derails the experience. It's safer to say that the game does things its own way, for better or worse, and that sometimes because of that logic, the best way to succeed is to abuse gaps in that logic, since one way or another, you're gonna have to sooner or later. The game really doesn't give you enough to survive the way it intends you to, often requiring you to make routine trips back to infinite refill spots for your health and or mana, but then at the same time, I wouldn't call the experience difficult either. Really, it's just a dungeon crawl that presents itself in a much different and simpler way, and then beyond that, it's really up to the player to decide how to run with it. Stonekeep was developed and published by Interplay in 1995, and as is plainly obvious, is a one-player 3D dungeon crawl. Now it has a decent array of audio support, and primarily runs in a VGA 320x200 256 color graphics mode. However, the movies which play outside of the game engine can be set to run in high-resolution graphics, although the movie files themselves are encoded at 640x350 resolution, for reasons which don't make any sense to me. Now you can either play the movies back in a window centered in the middle of a 640x480 SVGA display mode, or by some miracle, they managed to get 640x350 resolution, which is an EGA 16 color exclusive resolution, to work with 256 colors. That is not normal. It is not part of the VESA standards, and thus I have no idea how in the world they pulled that off. Suffice to say though, if you can play the movies back in that manner, they will fill the screen more appropriately. As for its current release state, it's still commercial and readily available from GOG and Steam as a digital download for $10, but if you fancy a physical copy, you're in luck. This one's very easy to find physical copies of. Loose, boxed, sealed, doesn't matter. And the prices aren't completely outrageous, all things considered, given that the box is shaped like a tombstone and has a cloth-bound novel inside explaining the backstory. To that end, loose copies of just the CD tend to go for only a few bucks, fully boxed runs between $20 and $40 depending on condition, and even sealed copies typically top out at around $100, which yes is still a lot to spend on a single game, but given the unique shape of the box and what you get inside, is kind of a bargain compared to other similar offerings for other titles. It kind of goes to show just how many copies of this one are floating around out there. I'm not going to go over the entire backstory for this game because it's extensive, given that the cloth-bound 154-page novel is included with physical copies of the game, while a PDF is provided with digital copies. Suffice to say, they were trying to do some serious world building with this one, with the manual even going so far as to recommend you read the novel first before playing the game. Which, I mean, most people can't be bothered to read a 5-page manual before they start playing a game, much less a 154-page novel, which doesn't even tell them how to play the game. Thankfully, though, it's not required reading. Instead, if you jump into the game, you'll be presented with an FMV showing an idyllic castle setting where our protagonist, Drake, still a child, is playing pretend with a sword as he slices an apple in half. But moments later and out of nowhere, a magical force starts moving in, completely disintegrating all living things in its wake. A person uses magic to rescue Drake from the castle as it and everything around gets sucked into the earth by the force of this magical spell, while Drake now watches from afar as an ominous figure looms over the destruction. We then cut to 10 years later, where Drake is now a young adult, well trained in combat, and has returned to the site of the chaos to try to determine what's happened to his home. A sparkle of light rises from the gaping chasm where the castle stood, taking an ethereal human form and identifying herself as Thera, goddess of the earth. She explains that in order to set things right, Drake needs to recover 9 receptacles from the ruins down below, and that in order to protect Drake from the evils within, she must separate Drake's spirit from his present physical form, which doesn't actually make any sense in context of what goes on in the game, but whatever, let's just roll with it. And, oh wait, we're already playing the game.
Your quest. The mystic mirror of Afri.
So yeah, Stonekeep kind of just drops you into everything without really explaining what to do, so you're going to want to have the manual on hand for the first little bit. Now that said, the controls are actually incredibly simple. You use the AWDS keys, or the arrow keys, to move forwards, backwards, and turn side to side in 90-degree increments. You use the left and right mouse buttons to utilize whatever you've placed in your left and right hands. The M key brings up your magic mirror so you can see yourself and your party. I is your inventory, and once you retrieve the journal, you'll be able to look up character details, magic runes, clues, item details, and automatically recorded maps, most of which you can append your own notes to, all using the tab key or the number keys to access specific chapters in the journal. Now that is something that I actually find incredibly annoying, is that you don't start with the journal, and in fact, it can take a bit before you finally do acquire it depending on where your exploration takes you at first. In fact, as far as I can tell, you don't technically need the journal to win the game, but then I didn't get far enough to know if magic is required to succeed or not, since if it is, then yeah, you would need the journal, since the only way to select runes for magic usage is with the journal, though I'm getting ahead of myself here. The main method of gameplay is very similar to other dungeon crawls presented in this manner, whereby you equip Drake with various pieces of armor and weapons, and then click the mouse buttons to attack enemies. The trouble, though, is that when you first start playing this game, the combat is going to feel incredibly delayed and unresponsive. But here's the thing, it's actually a lot simpler than it seems once you understand all of the quirks of the combat system in this game. Let's start with the most egregious one, the delay in the controls. What's actually going on is that there's a cooldown to every single weapon attack, meaning if you try to attack again while this cooldown is in effect, nothing will happen. This unfortunately also applies if you're dual wielding, as in if you try to attack with both weapons at the same time, you'll just alternate between each as their cooldowns expire, which doesn't produce any better of an attack rate than just going with a single weapon. Thus, whenever you're using a one-handed weapon, it's best to keep a shield in the other hand to improve your defense. However, attacking is also semi-automatic. If you're holding the mouse button down, you will attack as fast as that weapon will permit you to attack. Plus, if you level up your skill with a particular class of weapon, you'll also gain attack rate with that weapon. The other trick, though, is that you have to aim. So long as an enemy is directly in front of you, this won't be a big deal. But once you start fighting groups of enemies, it'll become more challenging to keep them lined up in such a way that you can deal damage with them effectively. Not to mention, some enemies are low to the ground and difficult to keep in range and in view so that you can attack them. Unfortunately, once you start getting more party members, they'll attack automatically, provided they're not too far to the side of where the enemy is. And Drake is always in the middle. You can have one more party member in the middle as well, and then there are slots on the left and right for additional party members. Though as far as I can tell, you're not allowed to decide which slots party members will move into. It's all automatic. I'll talk more about combat in a little, but since we're starting to get into this game's many methods of simplification, let's talk about the inventory. The way the inventory is presented here is as a magic scroll with an infinite amount of storage space. Now, seriously, you can cram every single thing you find into this scroll. It will not even remotely encumber you. Other than the fact that there's no fast way to get around in this scroll. Meaning, as you get further into the game, you're going to be spending ridiculous amounts of time scrolling this thing to access your many different items. I mean, sure, I found out later that the right mouse button scrolls faster than the left mouse button, but you're still going to be doing a lot of it. That said, picking up items is thankfully streamlined as well. Left-clicking will pick up an item and immediately open the inventory screen. Which I should note, while the inventory screen is up, all action is paused, thus you can take the opportunity to assess things, change weapons, maybe eat some food if you need hit points, etc. However, if you right-click on an item in the world instead, it'll simply go straight into your inventory, stacking if possible and desirable, though a few things don't stack automatically even though they can. For instance, scrolls will only stack if you stack them manually, since each scroll has its own writings on it. Once you start stacking scrolls, it can be annoying taking them out of the stack one at a time, trying to find the one that you want. Many items also have their own containers for storing them in large quantities for easier usage, such as a bag for holding rocks and various kinds of quivers for the various kinds of bow and crossbow ammunition. Though speaking of ammunition, you're going to notice before too long that ranged weapons are actually kinda powerful in this game. They have an atrocious rate of fire, but because enemies are typically locked to certain patrol areas, you can find spots where it's possible to line an enemy up without the enemy wanting to come any closer, and then take advantage of this to slaughter said enemy without having to deal with their attacks head on. That said, some enemies will indeed follow you anywhere, so this doesn't always work. Plus, there's a couple of more things about the enemies which are extremely pertinent: defense ratings and respawns. Now, in terms of respawns, I am happy to report that most enemies stay dead. It is very possible to virtually clear out an entire dungeon floor and then be able to traverse it without fear of being blindsided by an opponent. However, that's not to say there's no respawning at all. Rather instead, the game has various kinds of spawners present in certain areas, and if you attack enemies near those spawners or stick around too long, more enemies will spawn from those spawners. Now that said, anytime spawners are present, the enemies involved will generally not follow beyond the room that those spawners are in, or the immediate area of the map the spawner's been placed within. So even though the spawners can be annoying, you at least know where they are and when they'll be a problem, and can plan accordingly since it'll only be a problem temporarily as you explore the immediate area around it. Defense ratings is the big one though, and is the make or break of surviving virtually all manners of combat in this game. Every weapon can deal varying degrees of each of three kinds of damage: cut, crush, and pierce, with each opponent having varying degrees of defense against these damage types. These stats actually make a considerable difference to how much damage you can deal, sometimes leaving you with situations where your best weapon for taking out a particular enemy may actually be a weaker weapon you never thought you'd use again, like your starting dagger. Now, going along with the theme of simplifying the experience, you do indeed find lots of food as you make progress, but all food does is restore health. And given that you'll find special fountains before too long, which can provide you with an infinite amount of healing, it's important to save your food as much as you can. You'll also find various potions, and while they don't identify what they do, you can always jot down notes about them once you do learn what they do from experimenting with them and seeing what stats or effects they convey. Magic is also simplified to an extent, and comes down to the concept of learning runes, marking those runes onto a runecaster, and then using the runecaster the same as you would a weapon. Though for spell effects which target party members, you need to also bring up your Mystic Mirror to select who to target with the spell. Now, each runecaster can have 2 or more runes readied at a time, and each runecaster has its own mana pool, meaning as you find more runecasters, it's good to keep your old ones to provide you with additional mana to use per recharge. Now, it's also important to note that runes don't explicitly identify themselves, thus once you learn a new rune, it's best to try it out and then write a note in your journal next to the rune indicating what it does. Another thing I want to comment on though that I usually don't is the graphics, as I find the graphics in this game a little perplexing. And not because they aren't done well, but because I can't figure out exactly how they're doing it. You see, here's the thing. With any kind of 3D dungeon crawl, you'd typically render walls with some kind of 3D methodology, and then plop down sprites in various places to give some character to the surroundings. This game, however, is doing something interesting with the walls, and even the floors and ceilings, to feign much more dynamic surfaces than would otherwise be possible for a game of this vintage. The water effects in the sewers, for instance, are clearly not actually reflective water, and yet they come across as such. This game has clearly been built with careful attention to detail to ensure all of the seams are hidden. Well, almost all of the seams, though I'm about 80% certain this one was done intentionally. Every dungeon floor typically has a number of secrets to find, either hidden behind illusionary walls that you can walk through, or hidden inside panels you can open by finding loose bricks. Now, if a loose brick is present on a wall, it'll always be in the same spot for that style of wall, and you can watch the highlights showing its presence appear in real time as you finish moving, then disappear as you start moving again. So while it's extremely easy to spot where those kinds of secrets are, you have to be facing straight at them. And as for illusionary walls, most of those you just have to blind guess. Though for any which are required to find, you'll typically hear some kind of sound effect when you're next to them to give the impression of air moving through a tight opening. One of the last things I want to point out though is that the story is not a typical cut and dry delve through a dungeon. Now, as you progress, you'll run into dwarves who will aid your cause. You'll find out the Shargas you've been fighting are actually slaves who really don't want to be fighting, but don't have a choice in the matter, and save for a little refuge they've carved out for themselves, which you can walk around freely within, and this little gem hoarder who gives you clues as you give him more and more gems, some of which are more useful than others. And actually, there's an infamous bug related to the Wahuka here, where he can end up disappearing from the places he's supposed to appear on the first dungeon floor that he appears on. And this did indeed happen to me in my playthrough, though not right away, and thus I did get a solid number of hints out of him at first. Overall, Stonekeep is definitely above average for a 3D dungeon crawl, but it's certainly not going to be for everyone, given how streamlined it feels, yet how clunky some of the mechanics are. Plus, this is a long game. I played the game for about 10 hours, and after looking up details online, I believe I only got a little bit beyond the quarter waypoint. Heck, I didn't even run into any merchants by that point, so I have no idea how deep into the game they start appearing. Just that I know merchants do show up sooner or later. I would say if you're into dungeon crawls, definitely give this one a go, but if you're not a huge dungeon crawl fan, then maybe make the decision to get a copy based on if this, at the very least, looks appealing to you, with the exceptionally well done graphics coupled with the B-movie grade voice acting. Also, I noticed the music has a lot of issues deciding which tunes to play when and at what volume over the course of the experience, just in case that's relevant to your desire to try the game or not. Amazingly, this game runs perfectly fine in modern emulation by just leaving cycle set to auto and otherwise running with your default DOSBox settings. Though that said, the audio pops a lot when you first boot the game, with the pops slowly going away as you continue playing. Not quite sure if that's an emulation thing only, or if that actually happens on real hardware. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on March 8th will be another review, episode 340, where we're going to be taking a look at a quote-unquote hack-and-slash platformer, but one where the sprites are so big it almost doesn't qualify as a platformer and just as a hack-and-slash. Either way, make sure to stay tuned to see how good or terrible this game turns out to be. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to all the folks shown here supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show directly and see your name here as well, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.